at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Pitfalls of Unilateral Negotiations at the Paris Climate Change Conference. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member. The Obama administration's new electricity regulations will increase the control of the federal government over the lives of Americans and will burden American families. President Obama intends to submit these costly new requirements as the cornerstone of his proposal at the Paris UN Climate Conference. These severe measures will adversely affect our economy and have no significant impact on climate change. The President has pledged that the United States will cut its greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 28% over the next decade and by 80% or more by 2050. The pledge was made in preparation for the UN meeting now underway in Paris, which seeks to produce an international agreement that would impose legally binding requirements on the United States for decades to come. However, the committee learned from last month's hearing that the cornerstone of this administration's climate pledge reduction, the so-called Clean Power Plan, will do nothing to meet the President's pledge. Moreover, this regulation will cost billions of dollars, cause financial hardship for American families, and diminish the competitiveness of American employers, all with no significant benefit to climate change. In other words, it's all pain and no gain. It is well documented that the EPA's power plan will shut down power plants across the country, increase electricity prices, and cost thousands of Americans their jobs. The U.S. pledge to the UN is estimated to prevent only 1/50th of 1 degree Celsius temperature rise over the next 85 years. Incredible. This would be laughable if it weren't for the tremendous cost it imposes on the American people. EPA's own data shows that this regulation would reduce sea level rise by only 1/100th of an inch, the thickness of 3 sheets of paper. The President's power plan is nothing more than a power grab. It disregards the opposition of the majority in Congress and the governors of most states. The President attempts to justify his actions by scaring people with worst-case scenarios and biased data. An example of how this administration promotes its suspect climate agenda can be seen at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. Its employees altered historical climate data to get politically correct results in an attempt to disprove the 18-year lack of global temperature increases. NOAA further perpetrates this administration's agenda by dismissing accurate and calibrated satellite data. This data, considered by many to be the most objective, has clearly showed no warming for the past 2 decades. So NOAA and this administration simply chose to ignore the satellite data in its recent report. NOAA conveniently issued its news release promoting this report just as the Obama administration was about to announce its extensive climate change regulations. When the Science Committee raised concerns about NOAA's report, the agency refused to explain its findings and provide documents to the committee. The American people have a right to see the data and know the motivations behind the study. The American people should be suspicious of this administration when it continually impedes congressional oversight of its extreme climate agenda. Furthermore, statements by President Obama and others that attempt to link extreme weather events to climate change are completely unfounded. The lack of evidence is clear. No increased tornadoes, no increased hurricanes, no increased droughts or floods. The administration's claims are contradicted by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change itself. For instance, the IPCC found that there is, quote, low confidence on a global scale, end quote, that drought has increased in intensity or duration. The same lack of evidence can be found in the IPCC reports for almost every type of extreme weather. The administration's alarmism and exaggeration is not good science and intentionally misleads the American people. Congress has repeatedly rejected the President's extreme climate agenda, so the administration instead attempts to create laws on its own and to twist environmental regulations in ways Congress never intended. Now the administration has packaged up all these regulations and promised their implementation to the UN. The President's pledge to the UN would increase electricity costs, ration energy, and slow economic growth. The President's plan ignores good science and only seeks to advance a partisan political agenda. The President should come back to Congress with any agreement that is made in Paris. He won't because he knows the Senate will not ratify it. Today's hearing will demonstrate that the President's UN climate pledge is destructive to the American economy and would produce no substantive environmental benefits. That concludes my opening statement, and the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Eddie Bernice Johnson, is recognized for hers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me welcome our witnesses. Over the weekend, my constituents in Dallas, Texas, woke up from the Thanksgiving holiday to find streets submerged and homes flooded due to extreme rainfall that is only now showing signs of subsiding. Cars being overrun. Sadly, 8 people lost their lives in North Texas as a result of these floods. These same circumstances played out 6 months ago with equally tragic consequences. These kinds of extreme precipitation events are predicted to become more common with a change in climate, and they serve as a reminder that we must not forget how the stakes truly are and what the true cost of inaction will be.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Our first witness today is Mr. Orrin Cass, Senior Fellow for the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. Mr. Cass focuses on energy, environmental, and anti-poverty policy. He was the Domestic Policy Director of Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. Prior to joining the Manhattan Institute, Mr. Cass was a management consultant for Bain & Company. There he advised global companies across a range of industries on how to implement growth strategies and performance improvement programs. Mr. Cass received his bachelor's degree in political economy from Williams College and his law degree from Harvard University. Our second witness is Mr. Andrew Grossman, an associate at Baker & Hostetler. He has served as counsel in many prominent cases that raise significant issues of federal authority, the constitutional separation of powers, and individual rights. As a scholar, Mr. Grossman has written on administrative law, national security law, and the constitutional separation of powers. Mr. Grossman is a graduate of Dartmouth College and of University of Pennsylvania's Fels Institute of Government. He received his law degree from George Mason. Our final witness today, and this is unusual, joins us from Paris via Google Hangout, and he is Dr. Bjorn Lomborg, president of the Copenhagen Consensus Center. The Copenhagen Consensus Center brings together many of the world's top economists, which include 7 Nobel laureates, to seek priorities for the world. Dr. Lomborg is an academic and the author of the best-selling books, The Skeptical Environmentalist and Cool It. In addition, he is a visiting professor at Copenhagen Business School. Dr. Lomborg received his PhD in political science from the University of Copenhagen. Dr. Lomborg will actually be testifying last today because of the video conference that we have set up, and we'll begin now with the testimony from Mr. Cass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. My name is Orrin Cass. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. My primary message to the committee is this: the climate policies pursued by this country under President Obama are a bad deal for the climate and a bad deal for the country. Globally, climate negotiations no longer bear a substantial relationship to the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The commitments, known as INDCs, made by various countries are voluntary, and those made by developing nations do not depart from their existing emissions trajectories. Ms. Jackson, in her opening statement, suggested that pledges will lower warming by 2100 to 2.7 degrees Celsius, but that analysis assumes other, better actions will be taken at some point in the future and does not reflect what is actually included in the INDC commitments. The sum of all INDCs will likely affect the global temperature by the end of this century by 0 to 0.2 degrees Celsius. Indeed, the only likely achievement of the Paris Conference is an agreement by developed nations, including the U.S., to transfer enormous sums of wealth to poorer countries. This outcome is not surprising to those skeptical that U.S. leadership on climate policy could persuade the developing world to make economic sacrifices for the sake of reducing emissions. However, it differs dramatically from the popular narrative in which Paris represents the historic culmination of an effective process to bring the world together and act on climate. And it deals the harshest blow to anyone concerned about rising greenhouse gas emissions or interest in holding nations accountable for action. If progress under this process is supposed to come from peer pressure and so-called naming and shaming, then countries failing to take substantial and costly action should be named, shamed, and pressured. Instead, they are being applauded by the United Nations, the White House, the media, and non-governmental organizations committed to climate action. This fatally undermines the entire enterprise for the sake of photo ops and political point scoring. Domestically, even the Obama administration acknowledges that its policies make sense only if they influence international action. For instance, EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy, testifying before this committee in July, did not argue that the Clean Power Plan will have a detectable impact on global temperatures. Rather, she suggested, quote, "The value of this rule is not measured in that way. It is measured in showing strong domestic action which can actually trigger global action," end quote. If the objective of this nation's climate policy is to spur international action, the empty commitments of Paris make clear that the policy has failed. Yet proponents, including Ms. McCarthy, continue to argue that new regulations, subsidies, and mandates are ends unto themselves, that even if the mitigation of carbon dioxide emissions will not itself produce meaningful benefits, we should regulate anyway because the impositions on the nation's energy sector will be good for the economy. This argument defies both common sense and empirical evidence. Honest discussion of the costs and benefits of environmental regulation must begin from the acknowledgement that regulation does in fact have costs. In the absence of climate benefits, carbon dioxide regulations cannot be justified by claiming that the economic costs are themselves the benefits. Climate policy that does not help the climate is not good policy. Europe has gone down this path, suffered the consequences, and is turning back. Yet American policymakers in the White House seem determined to charge forward anyway. In summary, President Obama is placing the United States in a disastrous long-term position for the sake of securing a short-term political victory. In future years, when the world revisits commitments made today, countries that we applauded for promising nothing will be able to show that they are on track, because indeed they have promised only to do what they are on track to do. Yet the United States, having put forward an aggressive commitment that even the President's Clean Power Plan cannot achieve, will likely find ourselves off track. Americans will incur the expense to take costly domestic action. We will potentially send billions of dollars overseas to countries that take no such action themselves. And yet, as those countries' emissions grow unabated, we will be the ones facing scrutiny and criticism for violating the agreement that President Obama signs. This will be the President's climate legacy, and it is not a good one for the country. My written testimony provides additional detail on these points with respect to the INDC targets and commitments, as well as the analyses by economists and other scholars showing that environmental regulation does in fact have costs. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before the committee, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cass. Mr. Grossman.
Thank you, Mr. Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this hearing today and inviting me to testify. The committee has requested that I assess the legal aspects of the climate agreement being negotiated in Paris, and my conclusion is that as a legal matter, Paris is a farce. The point of the Paris negotiations is to create new obligations in international law, but it is our constitutional separation of powers that will effectively determine the parameters of that agreement because of a decision that the President made. The President decided that he would not seek the advice and consent of the Senate to ratify the Paris Agreement as a treaty, and he decided that he would not seek the legislative support of the House and Senate to implement the Paris Agreement as a congressional executive agreement. Instead, the President made the decision to do what he has done so many times in recent years, attempt to circumvent Congress and proceed on his own. Well, he's got his pen and he's got his phone, but what he doesn't have is the legislative power. And that means he is extremely constrained in terms of what he can lawfully accomplish through an executive agreement made on his sole authority. Let me concede that the President's authority to conclude executive agreements is a controversial subject, with many legal scholars having differing views about the scope of that authority. The law in this area is often uncertain, but it's not the uncertain parts that we're talking about today. The issues at play here are ones where there is broad agreement about what the President can and cannot do. That means we can review the likely components of a Paris deal and determine with great confidence where they stand under U.S. law. The two central objectives of the negotiations are financial commitments to foreign aid and emission reduction targets. These things cannot be implemented in any binding fashion consistent with U.S. law. The idea of the financial commitments, as I understand it, is for the United States and other developed nations to make transfer payments to the governments of poorer nations to coax them to forego cheap energy from traditional high-emission sources. There is an insurmountable legal issue here. The U.S. Constitution provides that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. In other words, a law enacted by Congress. For that reason, commitments of funds are often cited as the quintessential example of measures that the President cannot undertake on his sole authority. Now, I'm not aware of any serious disagreement on that point, so that is our legal conclusion. An agreement containing binding financial commitments cannot be executed on the President's sole authority. Binding emission reduction targets are likewise off the table. In assessing the President's authority to enter into an executive agreement, we look to historical practice and congressional consent. The leading legal authorities echo Justice Jackson's formula from the steel seizure case. The President's authority to enter into executive agreements is secure where he draws on consistent support in historical practice and congressional acquiescence. His power is at its lowest ebb where he lacks those things. The President lacks both of those things here. The historical practice is that international agreements concerning environmental protection have traditionally been entered as treaties in all or nearly every instance. And now that's according to an exhaustive survey by the Congressional Research Service. And that consistent practice includes the last major agreement concerning climate change to which the U.S. was a party, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The ratification history of that treaty rebuts any claim that Congress has acquiesced in allowing the President to bind the nation to emissions targets. When the Senate ratified the Framework Convention, it sought and extracted a pledge from the Bush administration that any future protocol containing targets and timetables would be subject to Senate ratification. Subsequently, President Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol, which did contain binding targets, but it was never sent to the Senate for ratification, it was never implemented, it was ultimately abandoned. In other words, the Kyoto Protocol, which concerns the very same subject matter as the Paris talks, was regarded by both political branches as a treaty subject to Senate ratification. And due to the inability to secure Senate ratification, the United States never deposited an instrument of ratification, binding it to Kyoto's terms. In foreign relations law, that series of events constitutes incredibly strong precedent. I therefore agree with the CRS's conclusion that any court weighing the claim that the President may adopt and implement quantitative emissions restrictions would most likely deem the executive's action an unconstitutional usurpation of congressional power. This is why Paris is a farce. The two central planks of any agreement have already been ruled out due to the President's decision to go it alone. So where does that leave the President? I see two possible outcomes. The first is the solution proposed by the administration, a so-called hybrid agreement. This would consist of legally binding and non-legally binding components. Foreign aid and admissions targets would be what the diplomats call political commitments, which means that they aren't legal commitments at all. In other words, they're non-binding. The other possibility is more objectionable. There is a real risk, I fear, the administration may view the red lines of U.S. law the same way it has viewed red lines in international affairs, as basically meaningless. What if the President purports on his sole authority to join a Paris Protocol containing binding financial commitments and emissions limitations? I think that Congress can and should guard against this risk, and the way to do it is to make clear the limits on presidential and legal authority in this area. If the President is not serious about holding the line, Congress can and should remind our negotiating partners, as well as the President, so that they are under no illusions about what the United States is likely to do. In other words, where enforceable measures are concerned, there is no avoiding Congress. Again, I thank the committee for the opportunity to offer these remarks, and I look forward to your questions.
I think it's 4:30 in the afternoon. I hope the weather is clear, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much to all your honored members. I'm actually going to show you some slides, so I hope that this will work at the same time. So we're pushing the technology to its fullest. And so here it is. So fundamentally, I would like to show you two main points, namely the impact and the cost of Paris. And as is perhaps not very surprising, I am going to take some issues with what Dr. Andrew Steer pointed out. So look, global warming is an important issue. It's man-made, it's a long-term problem, but I think what we need to understand is that we have little sense of the scale. Let me just show you this, and this is the UNFCCC, the ones that are organizing the the Paris meeting. If everybody does everything that is promised in Paris, we will cut the equivalent of 56 gigatons of CO2 till 2030. This is incontrovertible. Obviously, you can talk about, is it 40, is it 50, might it be 60? And just to show you what we're trying to achieve is about the 2-degree target will require us to cut more than 6,000 gigatons over the century. Johnson mentioned that we're possibly on the road to 2.7 degrees. That would require about 3,000 gigatons of reduction. So remember, we're 1 or 2% of the way. That's important because it gives us a sense of proportion. Now, let me just show you briefly with a clean power plan. It will, if it's achieved, reduce temperatures trivially, as has been pointed out several times. It'll reduce emissions by 4 gigatons by 2030 and 42 gigatons through the century. So again, just to show you the scale, 4, 42, and what we're talking about achieving is 6,000 gigatons. That's also why if you run it in a standard climate model, you won't be able to tell the difference. It's in my description, but just to summarize it, if we just do the clean power plan until 2030, it'll reduce temperatures by 0.007 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. And even if it's continued in its full implementation until the end of the century, it will reduce temperatures by 0.023 degrees Fahrenheit. Likewise, if you look at the U.S. climate promise, the promise to cut 26 to 28% below 2005 levels in 2025, it will reduce temperatures trivially. It will reduce 6 gigatons by 2025 and 100 gigatons throughout the century. Again, just look at the changes here. We're talking about a very, very small impact. And that's, of course, why if you run it in a climate model, again, you will get very, very small impacts. Again, if you actually keep your U.S. Paris promise until the end of the century, you will reduce temperatures by 1/20th of a degree Fahrenheit. And let me just share with you what is the impact of all the INDCs, all the Paris promises. If you run this through a standard climate model, this is what you see. You can actually tell the difference, but not by very much. So again, if we just keep our promise till 2030, which of course is the only thing on sale here, we will reduce temperatures by 0.09 degrees Fahrenheit. If indeed they're kept all the way through the century, they will reduce temperatures by about 1/3 of a degree Fahrenheit. That is important because we're essentially talking about very small changes. At the same time, the costs are significant. Now, Andrew Steer would like us to believe that this is not very much. Actually, overall, we're going to see increases in growth, and we're actually going to make money from this. But certainly all standard models, these are all the models from the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum and all the other multi-model forums that have looked at the cost of climate policies through a variety of different models. They indicate on average the cost for the U.S. is going to be about $154 billion if you do this well. And fundamentally that's because if you make energy more expensive, it will inevitably affect everything. It's not the end of the world economically, but it does have a cost of a couple of % of GDP, and that's what turns out. Of course, we also know that most policies, I'm sorry for this committee to say that, but most policies are not perhaps most effectively implemented, and then we know they can be even more costly. So it's likely that we will see a cost of at least $1 trillion globally and maybe even $2 trillion. And remember, this is the cost per year. And so in summary, the impacts of Paris are small, about 1/3 of a degree Fahrenheit at best. The cost of Paris is large. It's not a benefit. That's, of course, why we need everybody to cajole us into doing this. It's at least $1 trillion a year. Spending $1 trillion to cut virtually nothing of temperature, that's perhaps not the best way forward. And that's why we really need to recognize if we want to do better, we owe it to the world to spend our money better, both on focusing on R&D for green energy, as the chairwoman pointed out. That is what Bill Gates is now making us focus on. And of course also realize that there are many other problems we need to fix as a world. So again, I say thank you very much to the committee, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Lomborg, for that great testimony. I'll recognize myself for questions. Actually, you've anticipated my first question, which was, what impact would President Obama's pledge in Paris have on the Earth's climate? I think your word was it would have a trivial impact. You said all the pledges made in Paris would affect temperature by only 1/3 of a degree over the next 85 years, and the cost would be about $1 trillion a day. Is that all accurate?